Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. This Tuesday, we have Salvatore Rinaldo with us. Hey Salvatore, welcome back.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Salvatore, on Tuesdays, we dive into the teams and how sometimes they cause their own problems. But before we dive into that, do share with us, what was the book that most inspired you in your career as a Scrum Master?
That's a very good question. Of course, there's a lot of books, but if I'm allowed, I'd like to highlight two books. So I think these are two books that every Scrum Master / Agile coach should read and really try to apply in what they do with companies. So the first book I'll suggest is The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt. This is an absolute classic. It's all about lean thinking, and it's a must. And then the second book I'll suggest is a bit of a technical one, and it's Principles of Product Development Flow by Don Reinertsen. This is essential to every Scrum Master or Agile coach who wants to learn more about flow and how to apply it at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And both of these books talk about flow. Perhaps it is a good time now to discuss a little bit of how that comes into the work that we do as Scrum Masters. Very often we are working with teams, helping teams to deliver what the teams need to deliver. But when we talk about flow, we're not talking about one team. And yesterday we were talking about the system already. So walk us through how you see the importance of flow and how Scrum Masters need to take that into account.
So flow is essential because essentially it tells you how the organization produces value for customers. So if you take it from the customer's perspective and you start with what the outcomes should be to be successful on your market, you can then work it back and you can organize your structures, your operations, your processes, your capabilities in the best possible way to deliver flow. Normally, value will follow, the path of least resistance, so to speak. So by following the principles of flow, you can work out what the path of least resistance is for your organization. And it's different to any organization. So there is no one size fits all. It's really important for us as practitioners to understand the theory, but then when we work with organizations, especially leaders in these organizations, illustrate how these principles will apply to the organization, to the system at play, and how it relates to the business goals of the organization. We need to be able to justify how every change we suggest, every change that is adopted, ultimately relates back to the goals in a measurable way. We need to be able to quantify the impact of any change that we suggest in that sense.
And when we look at the books that you just suggested, I would definitely start with The Goal and definitely agree with you that that's a book that every single Scrum Master and Agile coach should read. Also because the way that the story is told is it's very relatable, right? Like there's a concrete challenge that the hero of that story needs to face, and very often or at least in my experience, it's very easy for us to relate that to a challenge we are seeing at work, right? And the way that they introduce the techniques, that Goldratt introduces the techniques that he then uses to evaluate the flow and improve flow over time as a systemic approach, which is another aspect of the goal, is very important. The goal, of course, the title alludes to what we are trying to achieve, right? Like we're not trying to complete more stories or get higher velocity, which is an anti-pattern in flow because the higher velocity in one team may cause problems in another team. Right. But it's about also, I think it's a great call to action for us to be very explicit and clear on what we are trying to achieve, right? Flow is there for a reason. It's not just there for its purpose, it's not flow for flow's purpose. It's flow for a particular goal, whatever that goal is. Are there any key lessons from that book, The Goal by Goldratt, that you still remember and still apply on a regular basis?
Yes, there is one in particular that I'd like to share with you, and that is about local optimization and how dangerous that is. As you correctly pointed out, we really need to be clear about the goal, explicit about the goal that we're trying to achieve, but also explicit about how we're going to measure success. Because the metrics that you choose will ultimately influence behavior. You tend to get what you measure, essentially. And so it's very important to choose metrics that are meaningful. You don't want to measure too many things or proxy variables. You should stay with your bottom line and make sure that the way that you organize your teams and your operations is aligned to ultimately what you want to get from your bottom line. So the difference between systemic thinking and an application of theory of constraints versus local optimization, that was the biggest takeaway for me. And that's something that you can apply pretty much everywhere, because every organization has those kind of challenges.
Absolutely. It is a great set of tools and methods to think about the problems that we see at work. So, Salvatore, on Tuesdays, of course, we also want to look at teams and how sometimes they cause their own problems and kind of get in their own way. So tell us a story of a team. Tell us a bit about the context, and then walk us through the story, those little behaviors and patterns that you started to notice that eventually led to problems.
Right. So there is one particular experience I want to share with you about this particular one. And it's about a team that I was working with a few years ago, a very talented team, a team of software engineers and also QA engineers working for a startup here in London. So it was a very talented team. I was impressed by their technical ability. But very soon after working with them, I noticed that, the way that they would organize the work and the way that they would perhaps plan the work was kind of going against their own objectives. In particular, what these teams would do was come up with a plan, and then a few days after agreeing on the plan, they would get distracted and by anything else that was happening around them, instead of focusing on what they had agreed to actually do and deliver. And often, some people from outside of the team, leaders, for example, would jump in and ask for stuff in the middle of a sprint, for example, and this team would quickly say yes to everything. They would kind of eager to impress their leaders. And I remember these conversations where maybe the day before you have agreed certain things with some of the developers, and then the next day reality has changed because perhaps they've had a conversation with leaders that you were not aware of. And these kind of it put me off as a Scrum Master, but it also didn't work very well for our product owner. We had a very good product owner at the time. She was she was accustomed to Scrum and Agile principles, and she was also very well connected to the rest of the organization. But somehow, this kind of behavior from the team could also, catch her upside. And so some of the things that this kind of behavior would lead to was unsuccessful sprints where you would produce lots of bugs, lack of alignment with QA, and in general, you had a feeling that there was a bit of an underlying frustration in the background, that the developers themselves would complain that they couldn't dedicate enough time to their own continuous learning and improvement journey. But then when you ask them, where is your improvement backlog? What are the things that you would like to improve? They would come unprepared because they were spending no time actually working on their continuous improvement journey. They would spend all of their time doing work. Somehow they felt that being productive means to get stuff out all the time.
More stuff, right?
Right, but the more the better. They had turned themselves into a feature factory without realizing it, because they were so eager to say yes to everyone and be seen as a productive team. Now, as a Scrum Master, I started to investigate the situation a bit more, and I found that this team was probably suffering from some psychological safety issues, as well as other things, but also internal conflicts. So one of the reasons why they hadn't been able to put together an improvement backlog is because every time they discussed what the improvement should be and how to go about it, they wouldn't come to an agreement very, very easily. And these conversations were actually quite painful for them. And I witnessed some of these conversations. They would have a go at each other simply for having different opinions or different ideas about things. So this was a very talented team, but they managed to self-destruct themselves by essentially turning themselves into a factory and not really looking ahead at the long term. At times, they were working as a collective of individuals rather than as a development team, so to speak.
And as Scrum Masters, of course, when we see something like this, a team that is eager to please external stakeholders and forgets about commitments they have made to each other and to other teams, of course, we start to worry because we know that these behaviors never get better unless we discuss about, what we need to change and how to put that into practice. And one of the things that jumped at me when you were describing your stories is the inability they had to talk about, okay, so how do we want to change? What do we want to change? It's almost as if they were afraid of being accountable to what they had agreed to.
Absolutely. There was a lack of accountability. There was also a lack of measurability as well. I mean, as a Scrum Master, I pointed out that you could use data and actually try to quantify the impact of some of your improvements in order to prioritize them. You could also use things like cost of delay, because even though we discuss many things and most of these things that we discuss seem to be good ideas, that doesn't imply that we should do all these good ideas now. Some of these things are still good ideas, but don't need to be done now. What is the cost of not doing it now? Whereas some other things are actually pretty urgent, things that are causing you technical debt or things that are causing you defects. Quality issues should be the first thing that we need to look at in order to get better as a team. Because then, as much as you want to be productive, right? The paradox is that you'll be spending most of your time fixing your own problems, which isn't productive at all in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also sounds to me that this team was perhaps passively and implicitly, perhaps explicitly, I don't know, resisting influence from the outside, right? Because, of course, as you said, the product owner wasn't happy either. And that communication did not lead to the team, acknowledging, okay, we need to change something, right? So it was almost as if they were pushing away any pressure to get better. They were just accepting, which is a great excuse not to improve, more ideas to work on, right? More features, more stuff to work on.
Absolutely, 100%. And that pressure was coming. It was a healthy pressure, and it was coming both from the product owner and from myself as a Scrum Master at the time. But as you correctly pointed out, it was being resisted at the time.
So for Scrum Masters out there who are probably facing a similar situation, what is a piece of advice that you have for us in terms of how to deal with a team that is stuck in this situation?
Two in particular. So the first one is look outside the team. Some of the symptoms, some of the problems that you're observing with the team might be symptoms of a problem rather than a problem itself. So look at outside of the team, how the leaders are influencing this team and why do they measure progress in the way that they do. The other suggestion I'd say is try to build some kind of integrity in the team. If you notice that the team is working as a group of individuals rather than as a team with its own story, with its own roadmap, with its own development journey, try to build up the team if you can, almost from scratch. Try to give them a sense of goals. Try to help them build their own vision, what good looks like. Make them dream a bit more. If you've noticed that they've been stuck in just doing work on a weekly basis without looking ahead. So try to build the team back up. And if there are trust issues, try to address those before you try and introduce any kind of technical change.
Yeah, and I think that you made a very good point. Like it might be that we need to look at the relationships between the team members before any other improvement can be put in place.
I think so.
Thank you for sharing this, Salvatore.
Thank you.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.